All right. Okay, this is Brian Lance with the Saturday meeting, LaRouche PAC, but also Schiller Institute meeting. And we're going to be talking today about infrastructure. And I think this will be a fun discussion, kind of filling in some holes for people. Giving people a sense of what is possible and what's being done and what's possible in the world, but right here in Texas as well. First of all, I want to underscore again the announcement of February 12th by President Trump that he wants to go with the big national infrastructure program. This is the beginning, as he emphasized in the meeting with the Republican and Democratic congressmen. This is the beginning of a discussion, a deliberation, in which legislation will come out, but it's going to come out essentially between now probably and the October elections or November elections, the 2018 elections. So this is going to be a period for a lot of debate, a lot of discussion. And just to quote Trump at the White House afterwards, meeting with members of Congress, he said, "I actually think we can go bipartisan on infrastructure. We put in our bid," that's the program, really unworkable program that was released by the White House on February 12th. "We put in our bid, come back with a proposal. We have a lot of people that are great Republicans that want something to happen." This is in response to a Democrat from the Midwest saying, "We want to come to you with our proposal." And he's saying, yes, do it. We've got a lot of great Republicans as well that want something to happen. We have to rebuild our country. So the door is open, and that's something that's not really reflected in the media, but the debate on infrastructure, including how to finance it, is going to be coming forward more and more. So today we're going to be discussing the building out of a physical economic platform, the concept of infrastructure that Mr. LaRouche, as an economist and statesman, introduced some years ago. Because the word infrastructure, partly because the word infrastructure has just become so, every day it's virtually lost meaning. It's like the word architecture. Now we talk about internet architecture. There's all kinds of, and infrastructure has become the same kind of loose jargon word thrown around. Awesome, like awesome, yes, like awesome. So there is a Senate committee. It's actually the Infrastructure or Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. It's chaired by Congressman Bill Schuster of Pennsylvania. The lead Democrat is Peter DeFazio of Oregon, and they're working on an infrastructure bipartisan bill. And they think it's going to come out in a matter of months. It's going to take months to hash it out. That's just to give you an indication that this process is underway. So we'll come back to this more. But Trump has begun a debate. Now, the very next day, that was on the 12th, the very next day, Christopher Wray, who's now serving as the increasingly notorious new head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee. And this was on worldwide security risks. And you can imagine the kind of heyday that neocons and others can make with this kind of stuff. But in the middle of talking about North Korea and nuclear weapons programs and so forth, with Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, Senator Marco Rubio asked, "What is the counterintelligence risk posed to U.S. national security from Chinese students, right? Particularly those in advanced programs in the sciences and mathematics?" And Wray just ran with this anti-China question to rave that Chinese students and scholars, academics, was a threat not only specifically in universities, but required a whole of society response. And the Confucius Institutes, of which I believe there's 100 or so in the United States. I may have that number wrong, but anyway, there's numerous Confucius Institutes set up on campuses in conjunction between universities and China. These were singled out as threats, attempting to manipulate minds, manipulate concepts of China, and to recruit intelligence assets and so on and so forth. This is Ray. Now, this is, if you remember with Comey, when Comey was still the head of the FBI, he talked about his J. Edgar Hoover moment. When he went to the Trump Tower with the Steele dossier and basically attempted to blackmail Trump into line with the Anglo-American establishment. Of course, Trump refused him and he fired him. Well, we've got another J. Edgar Hoover moment here. This is straight witch hunt McCarthyism. And so I want to bring this up, not just to bring it up, but there is a response which should be amplified. And of course, we with the Schiller Institute are absolutely opposed to this, this kind of thing. And we've written about it. We've published on this, the history of this kind of thing, the targeting of NASA, among other institutions in this regard. As Edward Teller warned a long time ago, national security restrictions on scientists actually end up undermining scientific work and discourse. Science is not something that works well, when you're in the dark. I just want to give you a sense of this in terms of the response. First of all, if I can find it here quickly, from Congress, the Asia Pacific Caucus, the Asia Pacific American Caucus of the U.S. Congress responded with a statement, which can be found on their website. And I'll just quote from a couple of the congressmen. This is Congressman Judy Chu, who's the chair of what's called SAPAC, Chinese, that's Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. She said, Senator Rubio's leading question and FBI Director Wray's sweepingly broad response were completely irresponsible generalizations that attempt to paint all Chinese students and scholars as spies for China. I condemn these remarks entirely and reject these dangerous attempts to build a case that Chinese students, professors, and scholars should be viewed with more suspicion than others. And she went on to cite the examples of Sherry Chen and Dr. Xiaoxin Shi, two Chinese-American scientists who were wrongfully accused by the FBI. The charges were later dropped, but of course their careers were destroyed in the process. As an example of this. And then Congresswoman Grace Ming from New York. I strongly condemn comments made by the Trump administration's FBI Director Christopher Wray that racially profiled international students from China. This narrative is unfortunately not new and should not be perpetuated by our country's highest law enforcement officials. And then just briefly from the Committee of 100, this is a nonpartisan organization of individuals who are considered illustrious Chinese Americans. It includes scientists. Yo-Yo Ma is one of the Committee of 100 and so forth. And again, they released a statement. It's available on their website that to target a whole group of people as being subject to greater suspicion based purely on race and national origin in advance of any facts or evidence goes against the fundamental American ideals of the presumption of innocence. Um, and as Americans, well, here, let me just, they go through a number of the prior cases in which the FBI's been found to have unjustly prosecuted individuals, Chinese Americans and Chinese scholars otherwise. For over 160 years, despite the stereotype of being perpetual foreigners, Chinese immigrants, many of whom arrived as students, have contributed immeasurably to the richness and success of the United States, including 8 Chinese Americans winning Nobel Prizes in the sciences while working in America. In every field, from the arts to the sciences, business to entertainment, politics to sports, Chinese Americans are loyal and hardworking citizens, no different than their neighbors, and so forth. So, I mean, I really, you know, this attempt really to drive the American people crazy, you know, can be and should be rightfully shut down. But also, I want to emphasize, I think that this is really another expression of the Trump derangement syndrome. You know, this is, you know, that's been manufactured. I mean, you have a hardcore that are out to simply tear the country apart, the Anglo-American elite, London-centered, British, empire-centered. But you have a lot of academics, people in the media, etc., who really have, as Barbara Boyd called it, become victims, you know, of Trump derangement syndrome, you know, and their alien selves have taken over, as she put it. And this is what we're dealing with. Now, just to come back to President Trump and give him his due, on Friday, President Trump, I wanted to mention this, you know, the day after Christopher Wray was testifying before the Senate Intelligence Committee, that's when Nicholas Cruz shot up the school in Florida the next day. And for which, of course, the FBI has now been forced to admit that they missed the evidence, they missed the clues, they didn't take the warning seriously, and so on. And that was the very next day. So here he is, a blanket attack on Chinese scholars and academics, American-born or otherwise. And but you know, the FBI, of course, can't stop crime. But then the next day, well, this is fast forward, I guess, a few days. But this last Friday, President Trump at the White House at the press conference with Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull emphasized our friendship with China, you know, speaking against this kind of rhetoric, and said, we've got a great relationship with China, but they're killing us on trade. My relationship with Xi Jinping is extraordinary. I like him. I think he likes me. China's tough, and they're getting tougher, but previous administrations have let that happen. But our relationship with China has never been better. I think we can have a good relationship with China, and I hope my relationship to President Xi will allow that to happen. So this is, I'm saying this to indicate that you have this fight, you know, inside the administration, really, and spreading out into a fight across the United States, you know, and President Trump has opened up avenues here. He's opened up avenues with China, with his trip to China last year. He's opened up channels to Russia, and he's opened up the infrastructure debate in the country as to how we can move forward, including with the new Silk Road. I think I'm going to set aside the, you know, the similar wave of attacks have been going on against Russia, but maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. But I'd like to move to to infrastructure, and I'll put up the first slide here. Oh boy, let's see. Can you turn off the lights here? Maybe they can see this at home. This doesn't come through very good. But this is the world lit up at night from space. This is a NASA photograph. And perhaps you can make out the bare outlines, more so of the United States, and then, of course, on the other side of the Atlantic, Europe. And then a bit way off on the far right, which is China along the coast, and a few other spots. That's, you can see that. That's yeah. All right.
Japan.
And I put it up there. We've used this kind of. I mean, of course, it underscores the lack of infrastructure that exists in South America and Africa and so forth. But it also underscores a point about infrastructure. Which is infrastructure has become more and more vital as mankind has spread out from the coasts and up the rivers. I mean, think about it. If you're basically, more or less in a hunting and gathering mode, fishing mode, etc., you've got your water with your rivers. You've got your transport system with rivers and lakes and so forth. But as you spread inland, as your population grows, as you develop, right, as you explore, well, then the question of this infrastructure of water, which also can be turned into various forms of energy or utilized to produce energy, water wheels and so on and so forth, used for irrigation. These things become things that have to be developed. And as what we're doing and what is occurring now with the the Belt and Road and similar projects is to fill in and build out the basis for man's continued existence. That is an artificial infrastructure. And I can't move these slides forward. Mine, I'm jammed up on this end. Okay. All right. So here's an example of what China's doing. Some of you may recognize it. This is the Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Shanghai Macau Bridge, a portion of it, which is opening this year. It has a, let's see if I can move forward again. No, it's going back. See if that, yeah, well, that's, okay, that works. This is, a schematic of it. This is the longest bridge built undersea in the world. It's 30 some miles long, 34 miles long. The dotted hash line there in the middle is the tunnel. The tunnel, which is 4.2 miles long, and it's the longest underwater tunnel road in the world. This project required, an enormous effort. Being at sea, it has to survive tidal action. It's built to withstand up to Category 8 earthquakes and super typhoons. And that underwater tunnel is 50 meters underwater, so that large ships can go, can continue to pass through and over. Right? So this is the deepest underwater tunnel in the world. Each one of the sections of the tunnel, I believe there's about 40 of them. I may be wrong on the number, but each one of them is compared in terms of weight to an aircraft carrier. That's what you're dealing with. Here is one of the man-made islands. This is from the road, still under construction, and what you see up there, those openings, apertures. That's the road going underwater, right? Now here's another project. Jumping ahead here. Let's go back. This is just the beginning. This is the beginning of the first Generation 4 nuclear breeder reactor, the CFR 600, which is being built along the coast of Hunan province. This is a sodium-cooled reactor. It uses sodium, which is a metal, as its coolant, and sodium, specific isotopes of sodium. I believe it's sodium 24. Are very neutron neutral. That is, neutrons can pass through. So this Generation 4 nuclear breeder reactor, which they expect to become the new, this is the model for the coming generation of reactors in China, but also elsewhere where they're developed around the world. They reprocess their own fuel. They reuse their own fuel and can use plutonium and other sources from taken from other older nuclear reactors. So this is going to be a closed cycle system. And they're expecting to go from 40 gigawatts of nuclear power now to 400 gigawatts by 2050 on the current schedule. I'm bringing these up just to give examples of what China's doing. Here is, what do you think this is?
Looks like a football stadium.
It's the railroad station in Beijing. That's the railroad station in Beijing for high-speed rail and I'm sure otherwise for freight and so forth as well. Here's a lineup of some of their high-speed rail. Of course, they lead the world in high-speed rail. We've discussed this many times, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Here's one of the high-speed rail trains leaving the Beijing station, just to give you a sense of the size of this. And if you take that train down to Shanghai, that's the station down in Shanghai on the East Coast, from which you can go, various and sundry other places. And that's an example of the new maglev trains, that slow maglev trains that only travel about 100 miles an hour, that are being developed and already are being deployed. This is an example of one of them, are being deployed for urban use. That is that, they float on air, on a cushion of air. They're quiet, they're more efficient, and fewer moving parts. And so they're now building a large factory as well to now begin to produce these trains for large scale use. They have 5 routes. They're now building trains for using maglev, the next generation. So as they continue to build out high-speed rail, they're also simultaneously moving to maglev. Xi Jinping with President Trump, that special relationship that's so important. And similarly, Trump with President Putin, this was at the APEC summit in Vietnam in the fall of last year.
Yeah, which APEC?
APEC, Asian Pacific Economic Commission.
Not the American.
Okay.
Right.
And of course, this is the schematic of the Silk Road projects overall, which we've discussed, reaching into Africa now in many points. The blue dots along the African coast, both sides, those are big port projects. Just to give you, a sense, this is large scale, and that doesn't really even show. Really only a few examples of the railroad projects in Africa. But again, that just gives you a sense of that. Again, we've discussed this, and we can come back to it if people have questions later. But of course, reaching all the way to Hamburg, Rotterdam, Spain, and so forth, through Central Europe, Austria, and so on. I want to turn now to China's largest cities, the mega cities. They're just listed here. You see this grouping down here around Hong Kong. You have Shenzhen, you have Guangzhou, and so forth down there in the Pearl River Basin or Delta area. That's We'll come back to that. And then up in the right, you have Beijing, top right. You see Beijing there. These are all the largest cities. These are all cities roughly in the range of 30 million people. Now what's going forward is the development of a mega city around Beijing. You may have heard something about this. And I want to put this up so people actually got a sense of the physical layout of what's being done here. Beijing, of course, is the national capital, but this is now being turned into the national capital region. And you have Tianjin there, which is a major port. It's a major city. You're already talking about tens of millions of people in Tianjin. Beijing itself, and then you see Hubei province, province, kind of surrounding this region. And this is all going to be integrated through a massive project which is now already underway, guesstimated to cost something like $300 billion equivalent to complete. But this region already has an enormous infrastructure that's already been built into it. 4 international airports, 5 high-speed rails, 2 more under construction, the 7th and 8th rings around Beijing and into Hubei. And this is going to be an area that's going to be developed. Hubei is considered a beautiful area with lakes, forests, agriculture, and so forth. And the expansion and integration of this is to disperse the population. That's not critical to Beijing itself, but in a region which is beautiful. It's part of this transformation process of changing and overcoming the smog problems and so forth of Beijing itself, is this development of the region. So this is underway now.
Excuse me, question.
Yeah.
How far is Beijing from North Korea?
Well, pretty close. Can we go back? Well, you can see it off there on the far right in white.
Yeah, is there a general guess about how many miles there are?
I'm sorry, I couldn't. How many?
I'm just curious.
Few hundred miles. Wow. Joel says. And that's an important point. Ivanka Trump is right now, of course, in South Korea, meeting with President Moon of South Korea, and this is all part of the effort to that includes, of course, working with Japan and China and Russia and so forth to resolve the crisis on the Korea Peninsula. Despite Mike Pence, our robot vice president, and other neocons. Here we come back. This is the Pearl River Delta and the cities in this area. The little thread here, you can see it right there. That's the bridge we were discussing, the Hong Kong Shuzhai Macau Bridge. There was a question came up earlier about Hong Kong, or not a question, but a discussion. You see Hong Kong in the point, out there on the point. Hong Kong is being integrated, as you can see, into this massive economic development area, which is already the largest in China. It accounts for something like, I believe the figure is something like 20% of the GDP of China comes out of this one area. Okay, now the U.S. Okay, mega cities. That's part of what I wanted to talk about today. That's what we said we would be discussing. And this is really not mega cities, but these are clusters, right? And you have a sense of that just looking at it and from what you know of these areas, from being there, traveling, or from coverage, news coverage and whatnot, including down here on the Gulf Coast. If we take New York, for example, this is a 100-mile radius. This is roughly what you'd be talking about in terms of something like the Beijing, Tianjin, Hubei province development program. This is the way in which we have to begin conceptualizing economic development, the building out of the physical economic platform for the rest of this century. In other words, the question is not simply that New York City has a broken down infrastructure problem, which won't go away. But you've got to now think about developing, because of the population density that already exists, but also the population density that will exist. You have to start thinking about an entire infrastructure for an entire region as a megacity. Now, let's turn to Texas. Well, 75% of the population of Texas lives within what's called, as you may know, the Texas Triangle, and sometimes called the Texaplex. And you can see, this area is well known to you. It's bounded by 45 and 35 coming down from Dallas-Fort Worth through Austin to San Antonio, and then, of course, the linkage across from San Antonio to Houston. We're just taking this as an example and saying, okay, if we're thinking about this big, if we're thinking about these things bigger than we've been allowed to think about them, how do we, what are we working with? 75% of the population of Texas is in that triangle. And there's an overlay with the major roads, arteries, if you will, of Texas as they exist now. And this is a projection in terms of population growth rates of Texas, and hopefully will grow faster. And you see a wide range of possibilities. There actually is an official Texas demographer. I don't know if he gets paid anything, but anyway. But 55 million people by 2050 is a rough guesstimate, including migration, and migration is largely internal migration, right? You're talking about migration in the United States and within Texas itself. So we're talking now. Here's just a quick one on the. It's important to keep this in mind. If you're going to develop an area in terms of infrastructure, what are you working with? What's the topography? I had a discussion with Dr. Hal Cooper on moving water west, and he pointed out that if you try to move water west, even up to, say, Austin, water weighs 8 pounds, 8.5 pounds, something like that a gallon. If you're going to start moving large amounts of water, your costs are going through the roof. If you're trying to move it uphill, that doesn't mean you can't do it, but your pumping costs and so forth, you're going to have to take that into account. This is the river systems of Texas. For you that are here, this is partly my tour guide of Texas, I guess, or a tour of Texas for you newcomers here who are here from out of state. But the flooding, the massive flooding with Harvey that we experienced here, you can see all those rivers are all draining down into the Gulf of Mexico in the greater Houston metropolitan area, really from Corpus Christi up to Beaumont, to be accurate about it. But you can see it's a tremendous amount of water that's coming down into that area. And in terms of water, we have to think in terms of aquifers, right? We're drawing down water if we're depending on water as the sole source of energy. Up here is the Ogallala Aquifer, the most famous aquifer. It stretches way, 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 way north and west. But this is the portion of it in Texas. But it's been drawn down very significantly. And this is the 1968 water plan for Texas that would have brought water from the Mississippi River all the way across to recharge the Ogallala Aquifer, but also to provide more water for irrigation, cities, and so forth in the north, and then the second canal down along the coast all the way down to the Rio Grande, also from the Mississippi. That actually took an amendment to the Constitution for it to be implemented. It lost in the vote by, I believe the figure was 600 votes for the entire state. We came that close. If it hadn't been for the cultural pessimism already sinking in, think of the Vietnam War, 67s, the 68ers, etc., it would have passed. This was under Governor John Connolly. Here is an updated version of this map, bringing us back to the Texas Triangle. Here's Houston here. This is a schematic drawn by Dr. Hal Cooper, our longtime collaborator on mega projects. Noted on his work on updating the NWAPA program, most specifically on the detailed mapping of the tunnel to cross the Aleutian Straits, the Bering Straits, excuse me. But this is his schematic for a reconceptualized canal, and this is across north of Houston, and this stretches from the Toledo Bend River on the far right, which is really the largest underutilized source of existing water in the South. It's the largest reservoir lake in the South, and it's one of the third or fourth in the nation, largest. And largely it just drains into holds water and then drains, it produces a little hydroelectric for some people up in that area, but otherwise just drains down the Sabine River into the Gulf.
Is that in Texas?
It's right. It's split between. It's right on the border between Texas and Louisiana. So it was jointly developed by the two states with no federal money. I mean, partly the federal government, didn't want to do it because there weren't any people there to utilize it. But they went ahead and built it. Great bass fishing, I understand. But that's a tremendous amount of water. And Cooper proposed linking that over to is that Lake? Am I jumping ahead? Sam Rayburn Reservoir, and then on over to Lake Livingston, and then on across to Somerville with addition of a couple of reservoirs in between needed on a couple of the rivers. So basically, what you're doing is creating a canal that could move water southwest out of the area. And this would be part of a system of water management to contain flooding. In other words, you can't wait till all this water gets down to Houston. You got to move it out, start moving it out. When you have these flood conditions, you've got to be able to move it out higher up on these river systems. So I think this is very much part of a working proposal, in sketch form of what could be done very effectively, not only to deal with flooding, but also that this could be utilized in providing water during drought conditions and moving water from one area to the other as you develop the entire region. Just again, thinking of building out the Texaplex, the Texas Triangle, as an urban area, not as a set of 4 or 5 cities, but as integrating into a complete economic whole. Here for Houston, some of you may know this map. This is the Army Corps of Engineers map from the early 1940s, with the Addicks and Barker reservoirs. Their proposal for a third reservoir on the White Oak Bayou, which ultimately joins the Buffalo Bayou out on the Ship Canal, and then here you have the Cypress Creek Levee, where there's now discussion. Well, this is where we need a reservoir to help keep water from going, on through as it did and into the Buffalo Bayou through Houston, flooding out downtown Houston in the process, and then coming out here and then wrecking a good portion of the Ship Canal. The other feature here, which I talked to Dr. Cooper about, and he said, I think you should propose it. Or, basically this is something, that should be put out. Note this canal. There's another one up here. But this one in particular, where this is drawn now, this southern canal, essentially kind of follows around along here, which is along what's now the Beltway 8. But you could go further south of that and sweep over. Anyway, you're coming into the Galveston Bay and moving a hell of a lot of water out of the area directly from the Barker and Addicks. And of course, you're crossing other areas which need drainage as well. So the idea of here it's labeled by the Army Corps South Canal is still a viable concept, whether it was built underground or above ground, cement lined above ground canal. It would be useful, and it would be coming out around the Dickinson area, which needs obviously tremendous drainage. I mean, they're one of the most hard hit areas with Harvey and the flooding. So now I put this up because you remember this was Hurricane Ike. If you were here, I mean, this was 2008. In other words, this was more of a direct hit than Hurricane Harvey, by far and away. And this is Interstate 45. If you've driven down to Galveston, you were driving through this area around Texas City. This is what it looked like in the aftermath.
What is that a picture? I'm sorry.
That's the aftermath of Hurricane Ike down around Texas City.
Okay.
And you're looking at, that's I-45.
Wow.
Right? It's a reminder,
Debris there on the.
That's boats and everything. That's just debris piled up on Interstate 45. After the water went out. Yeah. The hurricane created a massive surge, right? That came on up into Galveston Bay, and this is one of the part of the consequence of this. This was 2008. The point here is that obviously you've got to build infrastructure, whether you're building a canal or a tunnel bridge system to link with Hong Kong, or you're talking about Galveston and you're talking about the Gulf Coast. You've got to take account of the weather and the potential weather. In dealing with Hurricane Harvey, the question is not simply how do we get water out of here fast when there's too much of it, which can be done, but also how do we protect against hurricanes? Because if we get a surge, a 40 or 50 foot surge from a direct hurricane hit, coming in and up into the Galveston Bay and up the Ship Canal, it's going to literally wipe out the refineries. They're going to just be wiped out. And if they're wiped out, they probably won't be rebuilt, because everybody will just say the people around here, including the so-called city fathers and whatnot, are such idiots, that there's no point to rebuilding here. We can rebuild on the other end. The demand end is in China and Asia, right? We can take oil out of here and we can build the refineries on the receiving end. We don't have to build it on this end, which is done already. I mean, that's already been done in part. But that's it. That's just not me speaking. I mean, that's already part of the discussion. I mean, that's understood. And if we don't do something to actually protect in a fundamental way against hurricanes, this whole area can just become a dump. People won't have a reason to live here, raise their families here, and so on and so forth. So what, of course, is proposed, and there's a name to it because of what happened in 2008. It's called the Ike Dike, right? This is the blow up of it here, of that portion over there, modeled on what they did in the lowland countries in Europe, right? To build a operant gateway that rotates and closes, right? That would close off Galveston Bay to protect against an oncoming hurricane and specifically the surge. And along this, then you would also build a coastal spine. You have the Galveston seawall, but that's pretty pathetic, in terms of the overall threat. But but you would build a coastal spine otherwise along the entire region, a berm, essentially, a high berm to protect. But that gateway would be key to the Galveston Bay and the ship canal. And that's a picture of, I believe, the operating system that exists in the, I want to say the Netherlands, but it's not the Netherlands. Does anyone here know?
I think it is the Netherlands.
Is it the Netherlands? Okay, I'm right. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm right and I'm wrong. Okay. And in terms of water, I mean, just again, in terms of thinking about the parameters of economic development for this region over the next 50, 100 years, but it's also in terms of Beijing, it's also in terms of the New York, Philadelphia area or whatever, you've got to think in terms of how are you going to provide the resources required, water most fundamental. People might be surprised that still today, 60% of water in Texas is consumed by irrigation. That's not unimportant, that's important. And I can tell you that's flatlined. It's not that it's grown in recent years, it's flatlined. But nonetheless, it's still 60% for irrigation. If you go back to that 1968 program from bringing water from the Mississippi River that almost became law, was almost built, the context for that was the droughts and a recognition of population growth that was going to be occurring in Texas, and that a lot more water was going to be required. Now, we didn't build that system, but we did build 125 reservoirs between 1950 and into the 70s. I think up until 1980, we built 125 reservoirs in the state. I don't think there's a single lake that's actually a natural lake in Texas.
Right.
There's one,
Oh.
Caddo Lake. Caddo.
Caddo Lake. There's one lake. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. So this is already a man-made. What we have here in Texas, it can come as a surprise to some people, particularly in the middle of the rodeo period and all this, is that this is completely, we're living in a completely man-made environment. This is a physical economic infrastructure that's been built up. And with those reservoirs, we had enough to get by in terms of population growth over the last 4 decades, 5 decades up till now. Energy, industrial use of energy. This is a critical component. Obviously, let me tell you that this year, ERCOT is warning that with the shutdown of 3 coal-fired plants that occurred last year, we're going to have a lot less energy this summer. Quote, we're going into a summer where people are going to be paying a lot more, potentially paying a lot more, said Commissioner Brandy Marty Marquez. She repeated the phrase, a lot more. I didn't just repeat it, it's in her quote. ERCOT, which oversees 90% of the state's power grid, expects that it will lose more than 7,000 megawatts of power capacity by this summer. Okay? And 1 megawatt is enough to power 200 homes in the middle of summer in Texas. And we're expected to lose 7,000 megawatts of power. So this is the consequence of this jerry-rigged deregulation of energy that was implemented in Texas. Part of the Enron insanity, and ERCOT expects that there will be a growth in peak power demand, a growth of an average of 1.7% each year for the next decade. But we're shutting down power plants because they can't make enough money to keep operating under the ERCOT system. But of course, in the summer, when there's shortages, that's when the existing free market merchant energy producers will make money because there'll be massive shortages and they can they can charge what the market will bear, and at that point, everybody's willing to pay anything in the middle of summer to stay cool. So I'm just saying, now this is without taking into account any economic growth, any fundamental, profound economic growth in the region. Marcia?
What is ERCOT? I'm sorry.
Oh, ERCOT is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. They oversee. You get the idea.
Yeah.
They're running the thing into the ground.
Yeah.
And then you have weird debates going on. I mean, now you have the large grid scale batteries, that Tesla has developed and so forth. They stack them together. They built one in Australia.
For solar power.
For solar power. No, don't go to nuclear. We're gonna build these battery grids.
Wind to store all the wind.
Yes, yeah, to store wind and solar power. So when the wind's blowing, when the sun's shining, you collect it in these, batteries and store it, and then you can release it later on, to even out the process. You're trying to do more with what little you've got. You're just trying to manage a pathetic kind of broken down system. The merchant producers of energy, of course, are freaked out. They're actually legally fighting this because that's going to interfere with the high profitability they have during the summers, right? In other words, it'll make it unprofitable for them to produce energy at all. If you get the drift of this thing, where if you have a system top down, as you have in China in one form, and you organize it based on long-term concepts of value, physical value, in terms of payoff for the future, then you organize a system that's going to provide cheap electricity, that's going to provide water when you need it, and get rid of it when you don't, for the sake of the development of your people, of your nation, the general welfare. This is the flatlining of energy in the country. This is energy sales, a little different than energy use. Here's energy consumption per capita in the United States. You can see how that's flatlined and actually dropped. This is a simple term. This is just taking the total energy produced and then, of course, dividing them by the number of people. So it's both industrial use, non-industrial use, and so forth. But it gives you, what am I pointing to? I'm pointing to the fact that rather than increasing energy utilization and growing the physical economy, as we've discussed this in prior presentations, and and is now the subject of the economics class series that LaRouche Pack has begun, we've been worse than flatlining. We've been falling in terms of energy consumption. This has very practical implications. There's now the attempts to impose tariffs, penalizing tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum into the United States, not just from China, but from other countries as well. Well, the problem in the United States, as the consumers of aluminum and steel are pointing out, is, including the auto industry, is that we don't have the internal capacity in the United States to produce the steel and aluminum, if it's not imported. So all you're doing is increasing the price to the utilizers of that steel and aluminum. California, which used to be a major aluminum producer, the whole West Coast, but California in particular, because of Jerry Brown and because of the zero growth economic policies there, the electricity simply doesn't exist to produce aluminum anymore. No, that's the consequence. Texas railroads, green, blue, and red are the major railroads running through the state. The blue line here is the collapse in the number of miles of railroad in the country. Railroads are critical to the state and to the country. And this is the triangle for building out high-speed rail. It's been discussed now for decades. And of course, you see the straight shot from Houston to Dallas That's the one that's being talked about now is being built by the private sector. We can come back to it if you're interested. This was an earlier proposal made by Judge Robert Eccles. Not just him, but it was. You see a different concept of a high-speed rail linkage in this Texas Triangle. Here is Hal Cooper's presentation about 10 years ago on building out a national high-speed rail of phase 1 and 2. The red would be maglev. Phase 1 would be high-speed rail, the kind of thing that we would need to do to begin to catch up with China, for example, if we really wanted to compete with China. And this, of course, is where the 4 laws and the New Silk Road come in terms of the program for the United States, and is the basis of our 2018 policy agenda, which makes sure you get it on the way out. 2018 LaRouche PAC election platform, join the campaign to win the future, which I know Keisha's signed on to. Keisha Rogers has signed on to this as an agenda, and we're circulating it to legislators, congressmen, local officials, trade unions, and so forth. The point is to get, regardless of party affiliation, is an agreement on a program to build out the vital infrastructure this country actually needs. And that means, of course, Glass-Steagall. We can come back to that if it's, we can come back to these. But the campaign for the future, Glass-Steagall, to separate, to put up a firewall, to reorient credit back into production. Without that, you're not going to build anything. And national banking and national credit. Let me just say on this in terms of Houston and the flooding, I've had a lot of discussion. What happened there? I think I hit the wrong button there. Okay, all right, thank you. We've had a lot of discussions with state and local officials, and that's ongoing. And the similar process is going on in different ways around the country, in the Midwest, New York, out in San Francisco, Seattle, and so forth. If we take the example, as you well know, of Hurricane Harvey and the damage and destruction done, you know that there is not at this point, resources available to rebuild from that hurricane. The funds don't exist. More importantly, taking the long haul view, if you add up what's required to actually flood-proof the region and hurricane-proof the region, you've got to build out a much larger system. You've got to build the Ike Dike and coastal spine. That's roughly somewhere in the range of 15 to 25 billion. You've got to build out the Army Corps Harris Flood Control District plan to take to widen the ditches, the streams, the bayous, the drainage system of the area, which is now slated at best to be completed in 60 years. You've got to build it out now. That's a $25 billion program on the basis of their figures. If you're going to build a canal, as Dr. Hal Cooper proposed, and build it from the standpoint of being part of an integrated regional water management system to create water reliability, that is, managing shortages of water as well as surpluses, then you're talking about, you're probably talking about $100 billion at least. So, you can see that you're quickly adding up here to assist, to actually build out just simply the water reliability system for the region, for the southern part of the Texas Triangle. You're talking about something on the order of a half a trillion dollars, probably. Maybe half of that, 250 to 500. So where is that going to come from? How do you finance that? And that's where the national bank, national credit come in, because it's agreed. Elected officials know it. Local government can finance it. State government doesn't have it. Even we raid the rainy day fund. The federal government, it's a non-starter because the federal government, is in deficit, growing deficit after all of these wars. The Iraq War was financed off budget. It didn't even show up every year in the budget. It was just being spent. Trillions. It was just.
You mean the war didn't pay for itself?
No, the war did not pay for itself.
They said it would pay for itself. You mean they lied to us about that?
Something like that. The point here is that it's not simply a matter that the government can print money. That's going to be hyperinflation. So a national bank, who has the money, who has the resource, who has the money in terms of making a credit system work? Well, there's $7 or $8 trillion out there. U.S. banks hold trillions of dollars, $4 or $5 trillion in U.S. government securities right now. A portion of that they're just holding because they don't see anywhere else to put it. You have Japan with $1 trillion. You have China with 1.3 trillion. Those monies could be utilized more effectively, and China has proposed to do this, and Japan has indicated very clearly they're open to do this. They could use this money to capitalize a U.S. federal bank. They could put their U.S. securities into that bank, right? Exchanging debt for capital or equity, debt for equity in that bank. So our debt would be coming back to us. The debt we owe them would be coming back and be utilized to finance and leverage trillions of dollars. Even $1 trillion of investment into a bank, of a national bank, a national credit institution, would leverage $7 or $8 trillion in investment capacity. So this is the critical mechanism. This is modeled on what Hamilton did to get this country jump-started after the American Revolution, when we were in debt up to our eyeballs. We took in our own debt in the form of capitalizing a bank, the first national bank of the United States, and we jump-started the economy. So to do these things, this is what we have to do. That means through the government, we, the people, willfully organize an economic recovery. What China is doing willfully in building out, a modern physical economic platform with Chinese characteristics, we can do likewise with American characteristics. So let me stop there. That was wide-ranging. I wanted to kind of provoke people and get maps up there for people to look at and see what these projects look like and what these problems look like and kind of get some thinking on this. Thank you for your patience and attention. Go ahead, say yeah.
Well, to build all this, it's going to take more than money. It's going to take labor.
Right.
And I was just thinking, if we ask politely, our neighbors to the south in Mexico and the other nations, do you think that they would be willing to export some workers to help us build all this good stuff? I mean, if we ask really nice.
That's a good proposal. An ironic proposal, a provocative proposal. Mexico also has to build itself, likewise, and we can collaborate in doing that. Forget the NAFTA. We can do it on the same basis, because a national credit institution here can work with a similar institution in Mexico. Right. Just like we can work with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in China, and so on and so forth. So there can be that kind of collaboration. Nicholas Cruz, the shooter, Helga, addressed this the other day, being asked not about Cruz per se, but about the context of this, and said, look, the question here is, we have to elevate the culture. And a significant, without getting into all various aspects, that very much involves this question of elevating the optimism of the population, and particularly of youth. We have a tremendous underutilized workforce, and an unemployed workforce, and a part-time workforce. And frankly, a lot of people going to school, college, just because they don't know what else to do. And so if we initiate from a national standpoint this kind of nation-building process, the kind of optimism that can be unleashed, just think about the response to Hurricane Harvey.
Right.
With the Cajun Navy,
Mm-hmm.
People helping their neighbors, helping people they didn't know, complete strangers. The point is, that we can pull people together,
Mhm.
and that's not to set aside or leave aside the question of the question of culture in the broader sense. I mean, we've got to get kids off, the video games. We've got to get them out of the digital world, out of virtual reality, and into the real world, which is creating. And creating is something that, as you do it, it's also something you want to celebrate. And to do that, you need art that celebrates the actual creative process in very unique ways. And that's what great art does. Great classical art of every culture. And as we've emphasized, the dialogue of classical cultures is very much part of building out this new paradigm. But that, we certainly realize that, it's not a matter of turning schools into fortresses. That's been tried before, frankly, in places like New York City and the Bronx and so forth. I mean, that's hell. You're just creating a hell. You're creating prisons, in a different form. It's not going to be solved on that level. It's going to have to be solved on the level of inspiring a younger generation. And that's comes back to your workforce question. That's where the workforce, by and large, has to come from. But I'm sure we'll be inviting others to cross various borders and help us out, because we are going to face major labor shortages because of the low birth rates. Yeah.
There was the expectation that Donald Trump was going to bring some sort of financing proposal for infrastructure back after his meeting with China, or in China. And then there was an expectation that his infrastructure proposal was going to do something. How have things gone with this most recent proposal as the infrastructure funding?
Well, it doesn't work. But that's, I think the way I think, or one way to think about it, is all that Donald Trump did in that proposal was pass through Cohen's proposal, as he said, the White House proposal. He didn't claim it as his own. And I'm not sure if were you here when I was just starting the presentation. Trump said, "This is our opening bid. Now come back at us. We can do this bipartisan."
And that was supposed to be a goal for come back in 2 months.
Well, no, it's just open-ended. There's different proposals being floated. You have the people that are involved directly in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, for example, but you have other proposals coming, and we have our proposal. And we've got a broad discussion of that occurring now across the country. We need more of it. And the key is the American people getting behind, the platform, the election platform, the 2018 platform. But to specifics, just a week ago, CGTN TV, the Chinese language, English as well as Chinese, multi-language TV outlet, world TV outlet, featured in English a op-ed by Dr. John Gong, G-O-N-G, from Beijing University. And he titled it, if I recall correctly, "Make America Great Again with Chinese Money." with an exclamation point at the end of it. That was the title. And he went through. He said, essentially, we have the money. You don't. Trump wants to build infrastructure. President Trump, we agree. I said, you're absolutely right, correct in wanting to do what you're saying. All we need is a vehicle in which we can invest, our surpluses. They have some 3 trillion, almost 4 trillion, in surplus. And they've got over $1 trillion in U.S. government securities that are earning virtually no interest. They'd much rather put it into an infrastructure fund. I'll just call it a fund. He said into some vehicle. We'll do it. And that will help build America, but it'll build U.S.-China relations. So there it is again. This came out. I can't remember the time exactly, but roughly, I think it was within a couple days after President Trump had released the initial proposal on February 12th. So China's willing. China is there. So, but you've got to break Wall Street. You've got to break the City of London. Why did Trump only pass through Wall Street's proposal, which is all that proposal is? It's a proposal which says that the U.S. government over 10 years will come up with $200 billion for infrastructure. But part of even that is that the idea of raiding various funds, like funds that fund urban transit systems, to come up with that $200 billion. And then the other $800 billion is supposed to be from local and state governments. Well, local and state governments are already tapped out. So, we have, there's financing. There's a SWIFT program here in Texas that finance water projects and so forth. But, they're at their limits in terms of capabilities. So I just to say in a little more detail that the proposal by Trump, by the White House, that came out through the White House, was the Wall Street proposal. And it said basically public-private partnerships are the way to go. That's short term. That's 5-year projects, this kind of thing. That's toll roads. It's nothing. It's not a high-speed rail. It's nothing. You can't. It won't happen. So you've got to break the rules. That means you've got to break the control by London, by the British Empire. Now you see it, now you don't. British Empire, the kind of invisible empire, at least invisible a lot of times, that we see now with the Grassley memo, the Nunes, or the Grassley letter, the Nunes memo, and so forth. That in fact, from London, there has been this massive, full spectrum assault on the United States to break the Trump administration, prevent it first of all from getting elected, but then once President Trump got in the White House, to break it. So here's Trump, in a war and a half going on, being pounded, and he doesn't know what to do. He knows what to do. He's fighting, but on certain issues, he just said, "Oh, okay, this is what you want. Okay, put it out there to the American people, to the Congress, but then let's see what happens." Because who elected him? It was the American people. Ultimately, this is going to be determined by the American people, the outcome of this. The assault against Trump is being broken. That's occurring. There's a lot that can be said about that, but it continues to fall apart. There's the hysteria. Mueller's now indicted 13 Russians, who are in Russia, who will never be tried. In other words, Mueller will now never have to present his evidence because he has no evidence. This was a retread of a 2014 story, that made the rounds back in 2014. But, Mueller's just, he nails Manafort for 22 more charges. I mean, that has nothing to do with collusion, So anyway, so this is all going nowhere. In the real world, it's going nowhere. It's falling apart. So the ability of Trump with the American people, with others, to move with a real infrastructure program in cooperation with China, with other nations, coordinating collaboration among financial institutions, Asian Infrastructure Bank and National Bank here, so forth, not only to build out projects here, but for the U.S. to join in projects in South America, in Africa. You know, virtually all of the lending from U.S. banks in Africa goes for mining. You know, in other words, resource extraction.
Mhm.
China, we showed the charts on this just recently in our special report. You know, it's completely the other way around. Most of the investment from China is going into infrastructure. I mean, it's just a fact. You know, but that shouldn't be. We should be a productive nation, and we should be exporting, and we should be joining with, you know, Bechtel. We've got, you know, engineering companies and so forth should be joining with Chinese companies to build out African infrastructure with the African nations even more rapidly. You know, we have a real new paradigm emerging, but we still got this fight at home, and it is reflected in the fact that Trump could only present what he presented. But as he said, that's just an opening shot.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes.
There's an excellent discussion of that on the LaRouche website. If you go back to the February 16th Friday webcast, it's got a clip of Trump discussing the infrastructure question with Democratic senators, and it's got Paul
Gallagher.
Gallagher,
Mhm.
you know, discussing what we're saying about it. So it's very, very well done. It's an excellent.
Yeah. But if that it wasn't heard, the February 16th webcast with Paul Gallagher on the LaRouche PAC website is an excellent discussion, about an hour, 45 minutes an hour discussion. That starts with clips from Trump's own remarks at the White House after the release of his program and his discussion, portions of his discussion with congressmen, Democrats and Republicans there, on this whole infrastructure perspective. I mean, as he said, we got to rebuild the country. I mean,
Brian, just to make sure, the definition of infrastructure you're using includes hospitals, and schools, and those institutions necessary to support the labor force, right?
absolutely, and I think that's why it's important to kind of challenge oneself and challenge other people to use, you know, LaRouche's term of physical economic platform.
Mm.
Otherwise, yeah, it's what you talk about is hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, and they obviously go hand in hand. And I'm sure you have a sense of what's hard and what's meant by hard versus soft. But if you don't have a skilled workforce, you can't produce, right? If you don't have health care, you can't. You don't have the next generation, and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jackie.
Well, just a couple of things. One is just because I've talked to some school teachers who talk about overcrowded classrooms in America. Can you contrast? Do you know anything about like Chinese schools and what is the teacher to student ratio nowadays? Are they trying to work on that? Whereas, you know, I'm hearing in America sometimes you can have like 30 or more kids per teacher. What is it like in China?
Well, I had some figures. I don't have them in front of me now. I had them. I went through a few of them a month or two ago in a presentation briefly. So, as I recall, by you know, what roughly we would consider middle school, not yet seniors in high school, that kind of thing. But middle school, the number was around 16 kids per classroom. The lower grades, it was higher. You know, I think it was somewhere around 20, 25 students.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so, but beyond that, I mean, what is it? I mean, it's extraordinary the number of kids you have going to college in China. It's just an enormous number. You know, they have this, their whole focus on innovation. You know, what they term innovation officially. You know, from the top. Innovation requires this upgrading of the workforce, including, of course, importantly, the future workforce. I mean, it's just,
So more
you know,
people
it's
are
just
going to
rational
college in
thinking.
China than they were. More people are going to college in China now than there were before.
Yes,
Higher education is more of a priority
right.
in China.
And of course, there's a shift. They're also shifting, more towards the sciences, for example, than they were before. Before it was just everybody should get a college education, but then they were finding a problem that some people were getting out of college, but there weren't the jobs that could utilize them. I mean, you work on these things. It's a problem solving. It's the kind of problem you'd like to have. You want to have a problem where you're trying to, match skill sets.
What's needed in society.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, you had mentioned NAFTA briefly. And when I was a kid in college, I remember we had to do a paper or something, take a pro or con on that. And back then I read some articles and stuff. Do you have any thoughts on NAFTA and whether it had some things that were successful, things that failed, or what, because I remember seeing a documentary. It seemed like what it was saying is, it hurt people, like farmers ended up losing, potato farmers, and like they couldn't compete against like American ones because they were subsidized, whereas the ones in Mexico weren't. So you go to a grocery store and you're going to pick the cheapest potato, and that would take the. So I don't know, but I don't know if that was part of NAFTA or not. Do you know very much about that? Or
well, we campaigned against NAFTA. We put out a special
Yes.
report, executive. It's called Auschwitz South of the Border. The creation of these maquiladoras, where auto parts and all kinds of things are produced, and workers were getting $1 an hour, $2 an hour, whatever. I mean, it was bad, and it did disrupt agriculture massively on both sides of the border. The last figure I saw was that it's been some time ago, but that standards of living in Mexico fell by about 40% plus after NAFTA, as the overall long-term, kind of radiating effects.
They deregulated the food prices. Before NAFTA, the food prices were regulated.
In Mexico to support the agricultural sector.
over there
In there, yeah.
Mexico.
Mexican farming just got creamed.
That's
And-
what I thought, and the milk farmers too, because I saw one thing where the documentary, they just showed them pouring milk out into the street because they couldn't sell it or something. I don't know why, because they couldn't compete, or
Mhm.
and I don't know if that was related to NAFTA. Were there other Central American countries that were affected by NAFTA as well? And do you think that has contributed to the reason why there's immigration from the South coming to the United States, because they just can't get a job or a living?
Well, NAFTA, and I don't want to act like I'm a specialist on effects of NAFTA in Central America or something, right? But overall, I mean, more broadly, the monetarist system. This is the British Empire, the real British Anglo-American now empire. It's based on shortages, and it's based on manipulating shortages, and buying cheap and selling dear in the most cruel kind of fashion. And Central America, along with Mexico and South America, have simply been seen as looting grounds. To contrast, Japan in the 1980s was proposing to launch a massive program of industrialization of Mexico as part of an oil for technology deal or oil for technology transfer deal. Mitsubishi Institute. I mean, we were at LaRouche. Mr. LaRouche was in touch with, not just in touch, but collaborating in this, a dialogue on this, both on the Mexico side and on the Japan side. And the response of Schlesinger and the U.S. government was to say, we don't want a Japan south of the border. That would be a national security risk to the United States to have a Japan south of our border. That's literally what he said.
Like too strong, we couldn't work it. Yeah.
Well, it's it's insane kind of logic, but the point, keep them down.
Keep them down. And
yeah.
Right.
So the Paddock plan to seal the border. So NAFTA and of course the flow of illegal undocumented workers in the United States was a policy absolutely supported by one administration after the other as an attack on the U.S. labor force. Driving down wages and providing cheap labor right here in the United States. That's not to take any away from the rights of human beings anywhere. These illegal immigrants in the United States were used. And of course, some have struggled and gotten ahead and so on and so forth. But the point is that this was all part of a very cruel process. And likewise with Africa. Africa was not, IMF, World Bank, conditionalities policies. We'll lend to you, but only under these conditions, right? And those conditions could be imposition of new political institutions, which undermined existing power structures, right? Which weakened the central governments of these countries. They were conditionalities in terms of only certain low technology investments will be allowed. Projects are being built now by China that were refused by the World Bank. On the grounds that this was inappropriate. That to the existing society. We know better. You need to be poor. You need to be backward. And that was the term, official term, appropriate technology. Still a term used. IMF, World Bank jargon.
Yeah, they get to decide what's appropriate.
Right, that was the word.
Not the people that live there.
You move water by hand, by buckets or by people paddling a water wheel or something like that. Forget about large scale dams, irrigation systems. This is not appropriate, to your society. And so this is what's being overturned. And so you can imagine if you're sitting in London, this is absolutely the end of their world. And so this is the opportunity that we have. Yeah.
Yeah, and that I think it was just 3 years ago, the Chinese proposed to build high-speed rail from Mexico City up to the border of Texas. I forget which city. And
and now they're actually committed. Panama's committed in building railroads up to Costa Rica. And at Rice University here, when we had the forum, which was addressed by Ambassador Sosa, he stressed that railroad should go all the way up, up to Mexico. That the critical missing infrastructure for that whole region of Central America was rail. Modern rail system would transform the ability of farmers and so forth to get product to markets and
this thing got killed, and then Neto, I think, was the one who killed it, President Neto. Within the next month was riding in the Queen's carriage.
No, they went after his wife and said she had a mansion built by this guy who was working with the Chinese. It's always corruption, right? They're corrupt, so you can't let them build.
Yeah, right. That's the other, along with appropriate technology, is corruption.
Oh, so they're corrupt.
They're corrupt.
They're corrupt, okay. So using that as an excuse to not...
But now Mexico has gone, under the current president, has now, been to China, is now committed to collaboration with the Belt and Road. And you just had the China CELAC conference in Santo Domingo. Santiago, Chile. Yeah. Santiago, Chile. 33 foreign ministers, all the countries of the Caribbean and Latin America. That's what CELAC stands for. Caribbean and Latin American. So that's moving forward. But again, that's something that we should be, we could clearly be collaborating with from the standpoint of the kind of institutions that we could create. Perhaps we should end it there?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right.